So my name is Beth Eggleston. I'm from Humanitarian Advisory Group, and I'd like to welcome you all today. And before we begin, as is customary in Australia, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting today. So for me, I'm north of Melbourne, so I am on the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung people. And I would just like to give you a quick anecdote which links in to today's topic. The Dja Dja Wurrung people were well known for their cultural fire practices in terms of managing the landscape. And for many tens of thousands of years, this is a way in which they've been able to manage risk in the summer periods in this area in Australia. And since colonisation, this has been something that has been very much restricted. And since then, we have seen some catastrophic fire events in this area. And I just wanted to mention that because I thought it gave a real flavour of understanding the very real impacts of overlooking Indigenous knowledge and traditional wisdom, which is going to be our topic today. So thank you. As more of you are still joining us, please do feel free to pop in your name and organisation into the chat so we know where you're joining from. I'd like to thank you for joining on today, which is World Refugee Day, a very significant day as we're going to be discussing the value of Indigenous and traditional wisdom and knowledge and how this can be lost, overlooked and ignored, and recognising that this is something in Australia that we are still very much improving on. I would like to think there is still a lot of untapped knowledge and wisdom that we could be learning from our refugee population in Australia. So welcome to Meet the Ideas. This is our second session. Our first session that was just held very recently, and we can send the link out to you if that's one that you missed. It explored the importance of local leadership in humanitarian knowledge production. And we had speakers emphasising how the inequalities that the structure of the international humanitarian system has also has a real impact on those who experience humanitarian crisis. And why it's so important that that knowledge piece is actually how we change how the international system works, how it operates, and who leads that system. So today we're going to focus on Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous communities and how we want to understand our practices, how this knowledge, how it can be engaged in a meaningful way, not one that's tokenistic, but one in which we can embed this knowledge at the centre of how programs are designed and how priorities are set, and one that benefits Indigenous communities beyond humanitarian response. I wanted to give you a quick definition. I was reading a UN DRR report on traditional knowledge, and I thought this is quite interesting because it defines traditional knowledge or Indigenous wisdom as knowledge, practices and behaviours of Indigenous and local communities all around the world. It is passed from generation to generation, both orally and through practice. Usually it's collectively owned and takes the form of songs, stories, folklore, proverbs, cultural values, beliefs, rituals, community laws, agricultural methods and much more. It can often be sung, danced, painted, carved, chanted, performed, as well as spoken. So I wanted to give you the kind of whole gamut of what we're discussing today. We're not talking about, particular scientific methods only. We're talking about a whole range of different ways of thinking about the world and thinking about how we can respond to and recover from disasters. So let's jump right in. Firstly, what we're going to do is start with a poll. So the poll is going to be flashed up there, and I'll just read it out to you. Do you think the humanitarian sector engages with Indigenous knowledge in a meaningful way? So please just jump in and you can mark if you think completely, to some extent, not at all, or you don't know. So give a little answer there and we'll be able to see what people are thinking from this poll. Great. If you're just joining, thank you and welcome. We're just doing our first poll for the day. Great. Are we able to see the results of this poll as we start off, Pam?
Yes, we're just waiting for a few more to.
Few more. Get your poll fingers working. Let us know what you think. We know this is something that's important to you because you've jumped into this call. So please let us know what you think and we can show you the results on the screen. While we're waiting for that, I also just wanted to give a special, oh no, here we are. We're just looking at which screen we're looking at, Pam, for the results.
Can you see it now?
Not yet.
Pam is sharing the wrong screen.
Oh, okay. Let me just.
And we might just ask if we can ask people to mute until we ask for questions so that we don't get any feedback on the call. Thanks. We're just going to have a look at these poll results and then we're going to jump into our first questions. So as we're waiting for that, in the email that I sent out to you all today, I included the bios of our fabulous speakers who are joining us today. So you're able to see the different kind of experience, organisations and publications and experience that they have. So rather than spending our precious time today going into length, I'm just going to welcome again Siale, Vili and Alan to the call today. Oh, and here are some of our some interesting results here. So we can see that it sounds like there is a recognition of the importance, perhaps, of Indigenous knowledge, but we're certainly not there the whole way by the looks of things. And it's great to see some people saying that they don't know. So that very much indicates to us that perhaps the discussion about the importance of Indigenous knowledge isn't being happening around every table or in every organisation or in every program design. So that's really interesting, but great. It's heartening to see to some extent. And let's see if we can unpack that a little bit further today and see if we can move that dial a little bit and get people thinking more about the importance of Indigenous knowledge. So great. I wanted just to frame also on how we can ask questions to our panelists before I get the first chance to jump in. I want to let you know that there's going to be 3 ways in which you can ask questions. So there will be a Q&A after our first round of questions. So you're able to raise your hand. We'll call on you to ask your question. You can also type your question in the chat box, but we're also going to have a 3rd way, which is after our first round of questions that I'll be asking, you'll be able to ask questions anonymously through the Mentimeter. And there's going to be a link that you're going to be able to do that through. So there'll be 3 different ways. Raise your hand in the chat box or through the Mentimeter. So you'll be able to be crafting those questions as you listen to our wonderful panelists as we kick off. So I'm going to ask my first question actually to Alan, who's very humble, and I'm sure that he thought he would be getting the 3rd question, but we're going to go straight to you, Alan. Alan, we're keen to ask you, why do you think Indigenous knowledge is important in development in the Pacific? And can you make references to how this can align with humanitarian space? As you know, obviously, humanitarian assistance and international development are very much linked. But what can we learn from the development space that can help us to apply that when we're responding to disasters?
Thanks, Beth. Look, on the question, I guess a couple of things jump to mind within this, and I guess just in a kind of a preface to my response, I think it's important to note that, you know, as a Indigenous Pacific Islander who has been invited to speak on this panel today and to share knowledge against so your sort of question, you know, it's important that I acknowledge where we have gained this knowledge and insight, and this is important. I think it's important that I think I acknowledge that a lot of my learnings, my experiences, my skills, and everything that has allowed me to come onto this panel has sort of been gained through my link with my islands, with our oceans, and this is what helps keep us connected. So I think for those of us, the Pacific people that are working in areas of research or such as myself in monitoring and evaluation, we give and we gain value from our Pacific spaces by being present, and our ability to maintain our relevance and usefulness in these spaces is dependent on our connections with our people and our networks. So I think this is paramount to us. This sense of belonging, being valued, and being useful as a Pacific people in the context of Indigenous knowledge and its relevance to development. And I think this is often a critical element that is overlooked and often underrepresented as part of development understanding. But I'm sure my peers on this call will agree with some of the things that I've just mentioned. But I think Indigenous knowledge gives us insight into the way that people interact with each other, particularly in the Pacific Islands. The systems and the structures that exist, both informal and formal. So as a way of supporting better development, we need to be cognizant that this Indigenous and local knowledge, both from within these formal and informal institutions, have been drawn through cultural and historical legacies, but also have been shaped, in present day by the sort of new formal rules that we kind of see emerging. So, as a Pacific people at both national and community level, Pacific people understand and they have adapted and worked within these formal and informal spaces to influence change and as well to engage in decision making. And a lot of that Indigenous knowledge is based on sort of their cultural practices for how they make decisions, for how they distribute resources. And so interventions, when they're implemented in the Pacific, have to be cognizant of these stakeholders that sit in these spaces who and consider how this decision making occurs, so that they empower interaction and communication. And I guess this insight can help better inform projects within the humanitarian space. Because I think without these insights, most projects will either be short-lived without any sort of sustainability measure, or hopefully not, or may ultimately fail. So we really need to consider how this knowledge that comes from within gets communicated, and particularly I think for people like myself and with Siali and Willie on the call, our ability to remain connected, to help facilitate this bridge as Pacific Islanders, so that the connection to both development and to humanitarian, similarly, humanitarian work, is facilitated better. I may pause there because I think that's going to be quite a lot, and I'm sure my colleagues will add more value onto this discussion.
Thank you so much, Alan. I loved your idea of facilitating building a bridge. I think this is a really powerful metaphor, and it actually causes me to think of the wonderful reality that Australia is moving towards having a First Nations foreign policy, and in trying to embed and elevate some of that thinking in our interactions as a nation abroad. And all three of you on the call today do so much work internationally, and you're all straddling and facilitating to build those bridges, which is why it's wonderful having your specific insights with us today. Thank you. So Siale, I would love to go to you next. And you've been involved in a lot of different responses to a range of different crises in the Pacific. And I guess I'm keen to understand from past responses that you've seen, can you tell us a time in which you saw international and Indigenous knowledges that have been drawn on in a balanced and meaningful way? And what can be learnt from these practices?
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Beth. Thank you for the opportunity to have me here. It's a bit of a tricky question, because it's not like that we have seen international practices being adopted or being introduced to see if we could align that to Indigenous knowledge. But what I have seen much more lately, and I'm using this as example of the Tonga tsunami response, where there has been a lot of I would say a conversation that the young people were part of, and so they tend to articulate what we mean by indigenous and traditional knowledge, and to them the way that we had currently shaped it seems like that we associated wisdom and knowledge on the indigenous and traditions to people that kind of like Asia on the screen, that we are starting to have gray hair and you know, older and perhaps been seen that we have been around for a while. And so our understanding of tradition and indigenous seems to build over the years, which the young people now are challenging that. And they claim that they had as much understanding of their surrounding of their environment, their you know, the context of their of where they come from, as much as the older generations. And because of that, we started to see them challenging some of the older practices of agriculture, for example. And what we have seen that the international concept that are often used by civil society kind of find a niche of creeping in. And we started to see in the agricultural sector, for example, for Tonga National Youth Congress, where they have now get a lot more of the young people to lead their work in their nursery during the response time. And so that has been something that I've seen that it's, I find it quite interesting because it seems like that when we say inclusive and we look into how we embrace our young people, our young girls, in some of the work that are often regarded as gender role, then it seems like that does not fit in well to how we accept traditional way of thinking, because of how, you know, in our different culture, is still dominated by patriarchal structure. And so that is one interesting thing that I find that is quite, I find it quite amazing when the young people are challenging and say, no, this is not, indigenous and traditional is not just for old people. We do understand to some extent because we live the same conditions as how our older, we come from the islands, we live from maritime areas, we experience the same climate change impact that we have now. The other one that I find interesting, Beth, if I still have the time, you can tell me to stop talking, is the fact that we started to see the use of expressive art as an example from Kiribati, where we see that the use of that is starting to break down barriers on some of the sensitive issue, violence against women, for example. And then you started to see art in terms of their dance, of their poem, of their music being used to tell the message. And then I'm just using this because we do have projects in Kiribati, but I know that in Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, they do, that's quite an emerging area where they started using this to relay messages on how they, and we have started to see that used in the humanitarian sector as well. The last point is the building of trust, where I started to see now, when we have people like yourself, Beth, you come and interview us on some of the humanitarian work that we do, you ask a lot of questions and it tends to sometimes offend us sometimes. And so, but I have seen how some of the research work, and I think that's also because you encourage and you're embracing a lot more of the local researchers, that they started to use the Talanoa approach as a methodology, and you can start already see because it's a method, an indigenous methodology that is bring some kind of normalcy to those that we find that we can talk then about things that we often find that is only one person asking questions, and we are getting annoyed by too many questions, because that's not a good thing in the Pacific when you ask too many questions. But when you start using the the traditional indigenous methodology, we started to feel comfortable with that, and that opened up a whole lot of building trust, and where we can see that two different set of culture starting to complement each other. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you, Siali. Well, I'm glad that we're still asking you the hard questions, but I think that's so important what you said, because it's not just the what, it's the how, isn't it? That methodology piece that you mentioned. I think this is sometimes, this may be something we forget. We think about, oh, we need Indigenous knowledges to tell us what is the most appropriate thing to do, but it's also the how. And I loved your point about young people, though. It makes my heart sing to think of young people harnessing and wanting to own that traditional wisdom and knowledge as well, and not seeing that as something associated with older generations that they want to depart from, but they want to elevate. And also something they want to take forward. It's great to, you can't find all the traditional wisdom on YouTube. It's great to see younger people saying, no, we want to own this and we want to live this, and this is our truth as well. So that's really fantastic insights. Thank you, Siali. Now, Vili, if you haven't frozen to death, I have a question for you as well. I'd love to ask you, Vili, around what barriers do you think practitioners come up against when trying to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into their work? So we've seen from our poll that some people on this call feel like there is an attempt to actually do this. So we'd love to understand from you, what are some of those barriers that the people face in trying to implement that? And what enables the use of Indigenous knowledge?
Thank you very much for the question, and talo for everyone. Yeah, it's a very difficult one, because when we look at barriers, there is a sense of hopelessness, because there are so many barriers we're facing. But I think overall, there is a difference between a good intent to use the Indigenous knowledge and to looking for ways in order to integrate it and actually acting it. Because this leads to there is a limited recognition of the Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous systems, values, processes within the humanitarian space, although we talk a lot about it. And this leads to some form of misalignment between the need to prioritize the integration or the building of the bridge, as my brother Alan alluded to earlier, and actually doing it. Because at the local level is quite very strong, because the community base, because we know the first responders are the people on the ground, and they act and they use all of these Indigenous knowledge processes in part of it. But then when it comes up to the national level, the global level, where there are different standards or there are different knowledge systems that are existing, there is a bit of misalignment, and that leads to sometimes it's a lack of prioritization of these. So I'm trying to talk overarching in order to come down to three key things. We do not have a lot of resourcing put into this space. When I say resourcing, meaning time, and especially the human resources. We do not have many people putting into this space to actually find ways in order to build this bridge, as my brother Alan alluded to earlier, and also the capacity to actually do it. We also do not know enough or understand what is needed to bring into the humanitarian space. When I say we, I mean the practitioners, because most often they come from outside, they come in, they go. They come in, they go. When there's a disaster, they come, they go. But as Siali mentioned earlier, these understanding of not just the knowledge, but also the value processes comes with a level of trust and continuous engagement that needed to be built over time. And I think the third part of it is lack of leverage in the policy space. Because honestly speaking, I don't want to look into this as just a tick of the box, just to satisfy an agenda, to say that, yeah, it's okay to put an Indigenous tick. I want people to see that Indigenous knowledge systems and values provide an added value in order to make humanitarian actions more efficient, more effective, with very good impact, in order to save lives, improve human rights, or all of those principles in the Charter. So alignments of these practices, understanding what the practices that should be there and how to do it, especially within the standards of where they fit, is really, really critical, but it's also a very important area of its own. So yeah, those are some of the things that I would think of now just to trigger the conversation. They are more of overarching barriers, but then there are a lot of other small ones that are connecting to this. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Billy. So I would love you to start crafting some questions. I'm going to get Pam to put up the little link. If you would like to ask a question anonymously, you can do that through the Mentimeter. You can also just pop your hand up, or if you would like to pop something in the chat, please go ahead. So while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I've got a follow-up question for you, Vili, actually, because you touched on something that I know our set Humanitarian Advisory Group, and actually some of our research partners who I noticed who are online as well, in particular from Bangladesh, we've been doing some thinking and research on, which is the trust piece. I'd love if you have, I don't want to focus too much on the barriers, but in terms of building trust, are there other barriers or some enablers you see? You mentioned that long-term relationship that needs to be established and that trust to be established so that we're able to then be able to have an understanding about how Indigenous knowledge can be applied, utilised in a meaningful way. Do you have any thoughts on the trust piece?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's not just the trust of the people who are holding the knowledge, but it's also trust of the partners who have access to the people who hold the knowledge. Because often we see in the Pacific Island space, there are a lot of researchers who are just coming from overseas directly and trying to go to the communities to study these knowledge systems. But I think they need to trust the partners who are working with the communities. And we talk a lot about localization, the value of localization as humanitarian principle and also in action. But I also would like to say it's important to focus on that localization in everything, not just to deliver the aid, not just to do the assessments, but it's also important to look at them in terms of doing the research and working on this knowledge, because that trust is not just the trust of working with the communities, but it's also the trust of the people within the country. We saw that in COVID-19. And I think that was really, really valuable, because when the international partners were not able to travel because of the borders closure, they started to work much more with local partners, and they started to gain that trust. But I think most importantly, in that area, the local partners were trained. They were already set up, they were trained, the capacity was built before COVID-19. So there were already mechanisms in place and processes put in place during that time. So the trust factor here is not just to stay and work with the community, understanding and the values of respect of the people who own the money and understanding the level of access. They own the knowledge and the values, but the level of access, because these knowledge systems have different levels of access. There is a secrecy to some element of it. You are allowed to have access to this. There are others you're not allowed, depending on who you are. And then it's more important as well in this space for the global international partners to trust the local partners that they are working with, and build the capacity of local partners to ensure that the humanitarian processes and values are not just informed by traditional processes and values, but also global standards. And that is really important. So the trust down and also the trust up. And it takes time, because for us in the Pacific Islands, we work based on relationships. It takes time to develop, but it takes once more mistake or an error or an ignorance to break it. Thanks.
Wow, such wise words. I love what you were saying about trust being a two-way street. I think that's such an important piece, and the way that we have to nurture trust. You can't build it and forget about it. You have to keep nurturing it over time, because, like you say, it can break. So that's great. Thanks so much, Philly. So we have an excellent question in the chat. Thank you so much to you, Catherine. I think I would love to pose this question to you, actually, Siale. So a great question about sharing Indigenous knowledge between countries, and a question around, do any of the panel members have any experience or knowledge of an exchange between perhaps specific Indigenous knowledge with Australian First Nations community? Do you know about any cross-learnings and relationships and the different use, and seeing us really being able to elevate some of that knowledge? I might just start with you, Siale, if you have any thoughts on that question.
Thank you, Beth. No, I don't have any experience exchanging knowledge with the Indigenous community in Australia, First Nation, but we do already start exchanging knowledge within our own Pacific. The twin cyclone in Vanuatu, we then sent in one of our colleagues from Tonga and one from Fiji. Unfortunately, our colleagues from Solomon Islands was not able to make it, but we are starting to bring them as part of their like a response team. But really, when they go in, and this is the interesting thing that I find that is connected also to what Willie was sharing, in terms of building trust, that it comes from a value of reciprocity, like you have to give something, and in return you then expect the other person to openly share, and this is where the sharing of traditional knowledge can be done. And what we are using now is that those that are going from Fiji, before they start with their stories. Rather than going in and ask the Vanuatu, how did you find? Yeah, they start with their stories. They start with the stories of the community in Tongia, from the North Islands, that they are now going through a community-led relocation. We took the same stories that they had from Fiji to Tonga, because they're facing the same issue right now. And because that's where they started putting their own vulnerability in a way, like they, start there, and it's opened up the other person to share their stories, because they started to say, oh, we're not so much different from, from Tonga, from Samoa, from when you start hearing that the other person started with their stories. So they're not coming to tell you, to ask you to offload, yeah? They're coming in and say, let me start by giving my story. And then that also helped. The other thing that I just want to make a quick comment on is how we started to see, everyone has started to say that we will start something new, and the word innovation starts flying in, yeah? And then you started listening to what they're saying, and I said, actually, that is not really innovation. That has been done before. So how do we actually tell or sell an idea by not trying to be smart, but just saying, maybe this is an idea and you can contribute to identify that it could be something similar in your own culture that could build on that. I don't know whether it's related to the question. Sorry for the person asking the question, but that's just how I can answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Siale. Yes, maybe we need to frame it all as innovative Indigenous knowledge, and perhaps there would be more traction in project proposals and things like that. Alan, I'd love to see if you have any response to that question from Catherine.
Sure, thanks, Beth. Yeah, I thought I'd just add on to some of the points that Siale and Vili have raised, and I guess just in specific response to the question, I've had probably very little, but maybe 1 or 2 interactions where we've managed to bring together some Pacific groups with some First Nations groups. But for myself as a Pacific Island evaluator who spent a lot of time working in the Pacific Island countries, just as much as Siale, and really have at different levels, my current work with Latrobe has afforded me a sort of opportunity and privilege to go and do some First Nation work in the Northern Territory and interact with a lot of communities out in those remote areas and around the area of work which I do in evaluation. And so a lot of what I took with me as kind of my first kind of background is that I think what I took with me as sort of a transference from my work in communities in the Pacific is trying to keep some of the principles and values from the cultural approaches that I use in the evaluation space. So, things that I feel, apart from, not having recognizing that the communities that I work with are the owners of that knowledge, have the insight into how things work on the ground, how people interact, the relationships, the sort of systems and values, and myself as an outsider, the things that I can bring is probably a very culturally aware and respectful approach in order to be able to have a conversation at that level. And I think building on what Vili and Siale both said, in the Pacific, it's very important, that idea of knowledge gifting. At the start, when you asked me that first question, I very purposefully said what we give and what we gain from our interactions in the Pacific. So we recognize in the Pacific, knowledge is a resource, and people gift it when they feel you've earned it, as Vili had mentioned earlier. And so, going into the work that I've done in sort of some of these First Nation spaces in the Northern Territory, allowing people to share their stories, and in some cases, sitting with some elders in the community who would like, before they answer my questions, would like to tell me a sort of an hour-long conversation around the background and the history and the epistemology behind the skin names and how that connects people, and all of that, and just listening, and I'm not trying to understand all of that before we get to some substantive questions. So I think as an evaluator, we don't just go in and start hammering away with our questions in order to then extract some information. People feel they need to gain some connection with you, and trust and all those things are important. I can't build trust over sort of a first 1 week interaction, but I think people will get a sense, or what I felt was where I added value is, being able to keep that respectful approach, being able to allow people to talk and to listen, and where possible to ensure that what we were developing with them was first and foremost useful for their needs. So from an evaluation approach, allowing them to define, for the purpose of an evaluation approach, define not so much indicators, but measures of what they felt was important for their well-being of their communities. And I guess in the Pacific, this is what we're really trying to communicate. Those who work and are engaged with the communities are able to then help build that access to those conversations, to those spaces, and to those people, for them to be able to then define what is important for them, what they think should be measured, and information and data collected around, and then being able to then, for those of us on this call, as bridges, in a sense, be able to ensure that that's useful for those communities, but at the same time meeting the needs of external projects that have to meet accountability and donor requirements. So Yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I love what you know, framing knowledge as a resource. This is something throughout our research, looking at how that research, yes, can often be extracted and treated like a commodity and not recognized in where it was generated. And this seems to be really at the crux of, I think, this piece around how can we learn and to support humanitarian action, because it you know, maybe up until now has been a very extractive process. And I think, you know, moves to perhaps co-design and learn more maybe might get us away from those particular practices. Philly, I'd love to hear from you. I mean, you're now based in regional Victoria. Yeah, have you had any experience in this kind of knowledge transfer or shared experience?
Thanks again, Beth. I think, yeah, 8 months now with the Victoria Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub based here in Dookie, the University of Melbourne. Extremely cold at the moment. Yeah, there are two things here. It's exciting for me to learn from the farmers. And I have realized something, that although we have different farming systems with Australia, especially here in Victoria, compared to the Pacific Islands, but the fundamentals of the issues are similar. The problems and also the thinking processes are also similar. And when it comes to resilience and disaster response or disaster preparedness, we follow through the same processes. And I'm learning a lot on that front. Unfortunately, I think the way the system, as a researcher, the way the system has been set up, when I say system here, I say the development system. It's like we small island countries, we stick with small island countries. You Fiji, you compare to Tonga, Samoa, then we stick, or go to the Caribbeans and then do those kind of things. And it's quite rare to have a comparison of Fiji and Australia. And then because of this, it formed a huge barrier that they were not allocated resources to come together between the nations. The interesting thing, I went in one of the open days at the University of Melbourne at Dookie campus and heard one of my Indigenous Australian brothers was talking about food, because I'm a food security specialist. I'm in the food security cluster, and listening to him and how they use different plants for different purposes. And it's like, it reminded me of my own being in Samoa. Like, we talk about different parts of plants. They're different plants, but the same processes. And we're having discussions now looking at establishing relationships for research and exchanges between the students at the University of South Pacific and our group at the University of Melbourne, and also here with the farming systems here, just to look deeper into those processes for exchange. I'm really hoping that that will happen, and not grouping us again as small island all the times. There's so much to learn from the small islands to Australia, and also from Australia to the small islands. The second part about it, because this is an exchange with the Indo-Pacific, the islands. I was talking about this because I saw an Indigenous person from New Caledonia for the first time after about 7 years working in the Pacific Island, because the donor allowed the representation of people from New Caledonia to attend the meeting. And they came with a huge amount of knowledge of yam planting and a seasonal calendar of yam. And sometimes that's what I was talking about as that setback. He said, we're not allowed to come together because with different sizes of the islands, and also different, because the French territory is looking after New Caledonia. But now we, as researchers, we're working together with people from Papua New Guinea and some of the brothers and sisters from Melanesian countries. And then we're looking in putting together a book called The Weird Foods, because I was so shocked when one of my colleagues from Vanuatu, Robson, was telling me, Billy, don't you know that you can eat the young leaf of a breadfruit tree? I said, what? And then he kept listing all these different types of famine foods from Vanuatu. And I met another brother from Papua New Guinea. He said the same thing. So we're working at it, and then we call it the weird foods, trying to understand of how to cultivate them, cook them, things like that. And then we're also looking at exchanging of knowledges, early warning knowledge, traditional early warning systems, like the number of breadfruit trees on the tree, the locations of animals and some of these things. So we're looking at doing that, but this one has a huge question mark on it, because this is something very important for us. We have to test the efficacy of the traditional knowledge in order to make it useful and relevant, because there are some mismatch of traditional knowledge now, especially the forecasting ones. The flower is coming, but the fish is not appearing. Because these traditional knowledge were based on the relationships between the plants and the animals and their environment over time. And they were observed in a much more stable climate. But now with all the environmental degradation and then climate change, that relationship is, I think, shifting. So we're trying to start to see opportunities for a new knowledge emerging of this forecasting. So yeah, so there is an exchange, there is a potential for exchange, especially with Australia and other countries. And we're looking into doing research to test the efficacy of some of these traditional knowledge, like in the forecasting space. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy. That is great to know. And it's fascinating. I love to hear the curiosity of people learning about things that, you've been working on, for a really long time, and then to be able to learn these different pieces of information and see how they're applicable in different contexts and, other ways in which that knowledge can be used. So that's fantastic examples. Thank you. So Bill, you've got a question. Would you like to come off mute and ask your question to our panelists, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm wondering how we frame an institution, which would be, if we looked in the Western world, your IBM and then your startup, whether that's Facebook or Twitter or something newer than that, perhaps even what's that one from China? Another one, I mean. And how do we take what is essentially an institution vis-a-vis the climate prediction, or the predictions that you're forecasting that you're talking about, and then which is the established way, but for the Western world or for ASEAN, or as the case might be, it might be something really brand new, and it needs to be competitive as an alternative to what is established in that place. How do we take an institution and also make it something really quite new? I think there's a challenge in that space that we have to address.
So, Bill, are you sort of touching on what Siali said about putting the innovation lens on so that we can get traction and interest and kind of movement in looking at this kind of knowledge?
Well, yeah. So say Alan has an idea where he's sitting now, and he goes, "This is what we have here. This is our Indigenous knowledge, and it works, bang, bang, bang." And someone's sitting in Kenya, and they're going to get, someone comes in and says, "Well, here's a solution that we have, and you can only choose from the solutions that you can see." So how do we get Alan's solution, which might be appropriate at latitude XYZ, climate XYZ, and make that available to other people, and vice versa? How do we build dialogue with something that's institutional and perhaps available to the elders, but we might need it tomorrow to solve a problem tomorrow, and we need it to be available for dialogue within the communities that are speaking in the languages that are perhaps newer. How do we break down those silos, in other words, or how do we flatten that? There's an inherent challenge in taking an institution and making it revolutionary. I mean, in essence, it doesn't work in the Western world. That's not to say that it can't work elsewhere, but it's basically accepted that it's impossible to do that. You need the startup to come up with the fresh ideas. But these ideas are fresh to the rest of the world, but it's an institution in its home environment. And that in itself is an innovation. You know, that in itself, to create that process is itself a startup. It's a meta startup.
Thanks, Bill. I'm actually going to put this question to Siale because Siale, of course, works with a network, and I would sort of see that as being hubs of knowledge actually throughout the Pacific and sharing knowledge between different countries, different communities. I'd love your thoughts on that, Siale.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Bill, for throwing in hard questions when we are just like winding down our discussions. I probably can say that when Bill was asking the questions, I was thinking that there are, you know, we need to be quite clear that even our traditional knowledge, we don't have not all traditional knowledge are good. There's some of our traditional knowledge in our cultural perspective that need to be revamped. And as I have started sharing from where the youth are standing now, and when we are, you know, really also make reference to, you know, start looking into some of those Indigenous thinking as it's stand with climate change, because the tracking of where we see the observations of things doesn't seem to match anymore because of the changing environment. I can think of the kind of values in our traditional and Indigenous knowledge about everything that we had is in abundance, and it's aligned very well to the biblical faith that we had, where, you know, our Christian faith, God made things in abundance, does not fit in well to what we have now, where we have to really see the way that we shape our message, that we need to have responsible, sustainable way of looking at how we manage our resources, how we look into our ocean, how we look into our natural resources. And I think, Bill, that's probably where I picked up that there are some of those institutions, when we're talking about institutions, some of those institutions are holders of some of those practices, that some of them are not as good as it has been in the past. So we may also need to challenge the way that some of those institutions has been promoting. And one of the things that we, as we are talking about, where do we see alignment of in the national ideas and practices to our Indigenous and our traditional knowledge, is the fact that it could also be a good time now. I always refer to our young people because I find that oftentimes we're trying to hand over some kind of a legacy that may not always good, but perhaps we should also start finding space within some of these institutions, open up the space for young people to start their own new way of observing life, new way of defining what what's the new cultural values that they had that might be relevant for them. May not be relevant for us now because we only have like 1 or 2 more years to go and we are gone. But what is relevant for them now that it can take them forward, you know, and how do they see innovation, as Bill has just said, but give them time so that they create their own Indigenous understanding of life as everything now has changed. Thank you, Beth.
That's fabulous, Siali. And I think that piece, not all traditional knowledge is good. I think that is a very powerful statement and something for us to keep in our minds. And I love this idea that, yes, of course, traditional knowledge is being generated and created every day. It's not something just from our past. It is an ongoing process. So that's a great point. I would love to ask Alan, actually, Alan, just on sort of morphing off Bill's question, this piece around, what's your view on how universities play a role in being able to share, elevate, understand, research into perhaps that piece around sharing, knowledge in between countries? Where do you see the role of universities in doing that? And have they played a role in doing that well in the past, in your opinion?
Thanks, Beth. Initially, when I heard Bill's question, I thought it was touching upon intellectual property, which is a conversation I really didn't want to get started, but which is, I must say, an important issue around traditional knowledge in the Pacific, and it's something that's being highly debated and really is, front and center in a lot of those discussions around traditional knowledge and intellectual property and a lot of that. Again, just before I get into your question, Beth, and I think just coming off of on this question for knowledge, one of the things I wanted to note earlier is I guess people do see knowledge, and both Siali and Willie have touched upon, people see knowledge as something that has to be earned, and we talked about the gifting of knowledge, but in a sense, in the Pacific, in Fiji, what's this term that they use, the sort of solo solivaki, the coming together for the greater good, so people will share knowledge, if there's a sense that this adds to the greater good for their communities, and for other purposes, that it's contributing to something that will ultimately benefit themselves and others. Coming on to this question that you spoke about, look, I think a couple of things jump to mind. So one is this point that has been raised earlier around localization, locally led development, engaging local people. I think as we discover and as things around knowledge and what Billy spoke about around testing and validating the efficacy of these knowledge and knowledge practices, one is in an attempt to make them recognized, whereas they're valued in the Pacific, it's trying to make them valued beyond the Pacific in spaces where they're often not valued, and where we're trying to help build better recognition of these practices as being credible. And often, we recognize the challenge of making them credible is utilizing Western methodologies in order for people to then connect with them and say, oh, look, I understand now that this is a valuable practice because we've been able to validate it through some randomized control trial method or something something like that, and that's the only means that we will accept this knowledge as credible. So we believe that we can use other ways of trying to communicate or validate and build acceptance of the usefulness of these practices and potentially the usefulness in other spaces. I think first and foremost, whereas we would like for local researchers, academics, evaluators from within the Pacific to be the ones to communicate these messages directly, we recognize there are barriers to that as well. Both historical and colonial barriers that block people from valuing who's the messenger in this space. So at times like this, we, in the interim, as we're trying to negotiate a sort of a transference to Pacific Islanders, being the main voice in communicating these messages, academia and universities, and beyond in universities, think tanks and other kind of research institutions do have value in being able to speak on behalf. And I think if you can get to these processes where you can co-design, co-lead alongside local researchers, but then have the messages then consolidated and channeled through what is considered renowned institutions, you have a better chance of take up. So I think that's where we are at in the current space and time. We've seen a shift towards academia and research think tanks and institutions working alongside local researchers, and there's that kind of increased kind of recognition of local researchers being, of the role as co-leads in this space, and then products and knowledge pieces that are being produced are then being able to be channeled through the pipeline to the international community for take up, and we're seeing better chances of that. But where we would ultimately like to get to is at some point having this directly from Pacific Islanders presenting it directly. But we do, as I said earlier, there are colonial histories and legacies behind a lot of those blockages, as well as the methods for kind of validation, or as Willie talked about, the sort of testing the efficacy of these traditional knowledges and practices. I'm sure he can add a lot more to and make sense of what I've just said. Yeah. Thanks.
No, that's brilliant. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That almost that piece that we always talk about as, as local as possible and international as necessary, is the same as what you were just saying in terms of which are the organisations, think tanks or universities who are doing the elevating. It would be wonderful if they were always Indigenous-led organisations, and hopefully we'll get to a point when that may be the case. And Vili, love to get your thoughts on that, as well as just going to Jules's question around, do you think that national disaster management agencies, and perhaps I'll preface that by sort of saying we'll focus on ones in the Pacific, in your experience, have you seen that they actively are seeking input on Indigenous knowledge on how they lead the coordination in the response to disasters?
Are you asking me that?
I am asking you, Billy. I put you squarely on the spot there.
Yes, thanks. I think to add one thought on the earlier discussion with links to this, I think one important thing is context. And we understand that traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge is very context specific. But what is not just context specific is process, are the processes and the values, as alluded to earlier by Ellen and Siale. And from my experience in the Indigenous, in the humanitarian action space and work, not just with the national disaster management offices, but all the other partners on the ground, it's more focusing on those values of reciprocity, as mentioned earlier, like common good, communal focus, and then the working together of the people. So it's quite interesting when we look at that, because yes, I have seen the work of National Disaster Management Office. It's quite very participatory in role, which is founded on one of the most important principles in the Indigenous space. Is consultative, and it's also put on partnerships to share the resources, share the roles, to improve the reach, because we do recognize the fact that most of the NDMOs in the Pacific do not have many staff. They do not have much resources. And most of the work based on the acts and the policies, response and recovery in nature. And that's the humanitarian space. But they have worked a lot with partners, including communities. And community-based organizations in order to reach the communities. And part of the critical role there, I'm trying to say that there is a marriage of Indigenous processes, Indigenous values, Indigenous knowledge, and modern processes and modern systems. and capacity in order to build this system that can work collaboratively through genuine and durable partnerships with the people on the ground and the agencies that work with those people, but also at the same time maintain the standards of operating in such space to make sure that human rights and those rights-based approaches are promoted and adhered to at all times, because they also are the same with what the people want on the ground. In terms of what I was talking about earlier, that there is some form of misalignment between this good intention of working on the ground, working with local partners. I think there is a misalignment of the need to nationalize this approach. And I think sometimes it's mentioned to work and include Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous processes in the system, but the know-how to build that bridge, as Ellen mentioned earlier, and the capacity to do that and the resources to do that, it's often limited. And one of the key factors we must remember here in this space is that we always in a humanitarian crisis mode. And when we are preparing for the next disaster, most of the systems, we're just setting up the forms, just getting some disaster plan, and some of these disaster plan at the community includes those knowledge, but at the national level, sometimes it doesn't capture that. So while we are in the process of improving these systems, a cyclone hit. And while we are trying to respond to that, another one hit. And I think we need to step back. And I think it's good to establish that using the support from the humanitarian, like the advisory group and other partners in this space, to work with the partners on the ground, step back and try to set up these frameworks and set up these processes with the partners on the ground, because those guys on the ground are going like this: recovery, prepare, recovery. And there is not much time to step back and actually think of, okay, what is important, evaluate ourselves, what's important to include, learn from here. It's almost like no breathing space. But there is a very strong will there, and I think this is a really good room for important partnerships to take this forward. Thank you.
Yeah, I so agree with you. Really, it's such a luxury to have that space for reflection, isn't it? And you're right, that constant, just constant cycle of recovery and disaster doesn't allow, that luxury. So let's hope that that's something that we can help to be able to provide and be able to tease out some of those key issues. I am going to move to this is a great question here from Augustine, because we have focused a lot on the disaster space. And this is a great question that's looking at how Indigenous knowledge has been employed and used in terms of resolving conflict. So I wonder, Siali, if you've got some thoughts on how you've seen either Indigenous knowledge, processes, value systems, how they've been employed to build trust and to address conflict situations, specifically in the Pacific region. Do you have some thoughts on that one?
Yes, I have an experience on that. Unfortunately, it's an annoying experience for me because the way that and I'm talking about how the Tonga responds to in the tsunami, in their ongoing challenges of their relocation, because of how their land tenure system works. It's owned by the nobility, so the nobility have to give up the land and allocate the new land for those that has been relocated because of the tsunami. And then the government is given the opportunity, is given the mandated to look for resources to build the house. And because of how the community are so structured, as those of you who understand Tonga, they live in a very hierarchy society kind of systems. oftentimes those traditional knowledge is associated with that kind of different structures. And so when it comes to a situation like that, you will find that for those of us that are humanitarian practitioners, where we encourage them to speak out, encourage them to voice their concerns, pushing for government to have mechanisms so that community feel like that they're comfortable to raise some of those. You find that they kind of fall back to the. I would say that they would rather hold peace, have peaceful dialogue with different stakeholders, rather than listening to people like myself, where we just like want to see change happening. And so I think there are times when some of our indigenous knowledge are being used as a mechanisms for they're looking at their community, they're looking at the country, that are looking at a much more broader perspective in terms of how they maintain peace, how they look into making sure that one of them raising one voice mean that should not put the rest of the community at risk of not having a house. And so you find that they're looking much more at the communal well-being. So if one family get a house, they will not say anything until everybody has some confirmation that they all have it. And if they don't have it, they rather just said, okay, let's all of us not have it. It's sometimes it's good for keeping the peace, but it's often not good for my own peace. When I see people not really being when you see officials are using some of those traditional indigenous considerations of our local community and take advantage of that. And this is probably where we're coming back to the first questions. Where do we see some of the international values and concepts in terms of humanitarian that we need to perhaps choose which one is best? Because when it comes to this kind of conversation, and people like myself, where you kind of bring human rights lens to some of this conversation, it often doesn't seem to match. Yes, that's a hard question. Now I'm starting to bring all my annoying experiences in the humanitarian sector.
I think this is so valuable, Siali, though. We have to recognize these tensions, absolutely, between perhaps humanitarian principles, and it is going to rub up against traditional knowledge and ways of doing things in every single country. That's the nature, and why those principles are so important, but why they're so difficult to uphold, and they're in tension with themselves. So when it comes to conflict, you're absolutely right. You are. By providing humanitarian assistance sometimes in international development, it is seeking to change some of those dynamics, which is going to cause friction. Thank you, Siali. I would love, Vili, for you to chat a little bit through a great question from Raul. I'd love you to perhaps chat a little bit more around this piece around, is Indigenous knowledge sort of being drawn into some of the more scientific information that is shared in the Pacific, in particular around meteorological services, but probably other sciences as well. Do you want to give us a little bit of an overview about some of the work that SPREP's doing there, Vili?
So thanks. Yeah, I added some things in the chat. Yes, SPREP has been working on that space, and they've been working with the national Met offices around the Pacific Islands, trying to document the traditional knowledge of forecasting, and then trying to work on checking the efficacy of the traditional knowledge and see how they could incorporate them in the forecast, because that's recognizing that people do not understand the statistics, and sometimes it's misinterpreted and led to frustrations, and then everybody throw out the radio sometimes when they hear the forecast, because sometimes they say like, tomorrow there is no rain in Suva, and then the next day it's flooded in Suva. So Suva is a large area of space like that. So they're trying to look at some of these forecastings, and I think they're really good people. They're working in that space. There have been acrometeorology work done, I think, in Vanuatu, in Tonga as well, who've been documenting some of these forecastings as well, and trying to include that. They had an app that was developed, I think, by the South Koreans, the projects, and it was working well. And that's why, like earlier on, I was talking about the driver, because sometimes when it is your knowledge, you take it for like, you say like, well, there's no need to share it or no need to include it in processes because it's already there. And that is a common assumption that is there. So sometimes when we put it in the app like that, and people read it, and then they said, okay, and when after the funding, then there was no more updating or keeping that app working or more relevant. And then I was also saying to Rahul that we're writing a paper on this, looking at the impacts of climate change on traditional knowledge because of these mismatches. And some of these TKs, especially in the forecasting space, were developed in a much more stable climate, friendly environment. But now we are in a completely different time. And then we know that traditional knowledge has been recognized as a critical asset to reducing vulnerabilities. But now if that traditional knowledge has been impacted by climate change and its efficacy is not there as it was before, then we're gonna go more vulnerable. And we've seen some of the localized knowledge, like in the area in Sambeto in Fiji, very close to the Nandi airport. And sometimes they say it will be a beautiful day, but then you just talk to those people and say, oh, you just look at the mountain. There's a certain color of a cloud. In 2 hours, this river will be flooded. And then, but the forecast says it's going to be a beautiful day around that area. And there are some very specific knowledge that are quite very specific for those communities that not even the best meteorological model can forecast. And we saw 2 of those ones. For breadfruits, I was tracking my breadfruits outside my house at the University of South Pacific from 2015, using the 1, 2, 3 breadfruit index that the traditional knowledge said. And it was correct all along. We had TC Winston in 2016, and then it go. And sometimes when the Met forecast says that, the cyclone will come from Vanuatu, north of Fiji, and it will come close to Suva where we were. I just look outside my window to my breadfruit. I say, no, it's not going to come. And then it was correct all along until TC Herald in 2020, during COVID-19. There was no breadfruit tree on the breadfruit. And they would say like, oh, so the index is 1, 2, 3, but now it's 0. What happens now? And then the cyclone came very close to Suva. So I think it's really critical to recognize that, but we have to document the efficacy and check and evaluate these knowledge systems for their applications, because it's not just weather forecast. They use the flowering of the tree to know when a certain fish comes. But what happens when a mismatch comes up? It will lead to the lack of belief or trust in the traditional knowledge, especially from the younger generation. And then they said, oh, that old man lied, or this is, or, and then they continue to go back and play video games. So it has a cycle of issues when it comes to that. But thanks, really happy to have this discussion. Thanks, Rahul, for the question.
So Vili, what you're saying is we just need to have maybe some more video games that have a focus on Indigenous knowledge. Maybe this is the innovation that we've been missing. So we'll have to think about that.
Yeah, they have to do those, but including some of these specific forecasts and some of these things.
Yeah,
okay. And talking of this innovation, it's quite interesting. Talanoa process is all over the world, and it's been used by academics. The phono structure and some of those methods came from these systems. And drinking kava is all over the world right now, and it's becoming like an important part of dialogue or discussions. Even around here, I saw a kava bar in Bendigo. Yeah, here in Victoria. So I'm yet to visit. I'm trying to stay away from it. But thanks.
Yeah. Well, we'll make a time to go and meet there, Vili. That sounds fine. So I'm looking at time. I would love us to get to Chris's questions. So I'm going to ask Chris if he can come off mute and ask his question. Then we'll go quickly to the question that's been asked on the Mentimeter. So Chris, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Alan, Vili, Siale. Lovely to see you all. So my question is really about the way that in Western institutions and universities, the tendency to separate out ways of being and relating to ways of knowing. But everything you've talked about is that ways of being and relating are inseparable from ways of knowing and sharing knowledge and the rest of it. And I wonder if that's part of the challenge we have. And if so, how do you go about trying to address it?
Alan, would you like to kick us off on that discussion, or Siale? I think Siale may have been hitting her button. Over to you, Siale.
Oh, did I? Okay.
You did.
Okay. You know, I like to answer Chris' questions by answering my own thinking in terms of when Vili was talking earlier. I was actually thinking of community-generated data. And this probably connect to Chris' questions, because a lot of us in the Pacific, we often find that information that we provided are just like, that's it. And there's no need to validate the stories that you collected from community. But unfortunately, that's the process that you're using now with Humanitarian, where like in Fiji, with the Fiji Council of Social Services, they have come up with this brilliant idea of, rather than waiting for do a rapid assessment at the end of a cyclone, when there's a heavy rain, they start calling their contact point to send in already established templates of them telling the stories of, you know, this river is already up by a meter, or this, you know, or this place is already. So they're just doing observations of what's happening around them, and then share that where the team put it together and inform the NDMO of what's happening coming from the community. But then you still have to face the you know, the system requesting for validation, requesting that we have to come back or go back to those that are telling their stories to have some sense of validating that is not just like a one-off, like Vili's breadfruit tree that must have been like got COVID and did not bear fruit for that season. But I think this is probably where we find that the data that we provided are often not separated from who we are. The data is us. And so when we are trying to come in to separate your stories and how you live your life and which community you're part of, then you started to feel like that you may have missed out something. I don't know how you can capture all of it in one go, but that's probably There you go, Chris. I don't know whether I answer your question, but that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Siale. Before we're going to go to Alan, and as Alan, you start off, we're just going to see our Mentimeter question on the screen as well. So over to you, Alan, and then all of you can have a look at the last question there as well.
Look, I'm going to be very brief. I think we've touched upon a few elements of what Chris has alluded to in his question, but I guess, yeah, just to summarize, I mean, all of this relationality is very important in the Pacific. So yes, completely agree. And I think in the Pacific Islands, it's a lot of initiatives, programs of development programs of projects, research projects, they're all trying to get to the what, but for us, it's the who is asking the questions, and how they're asking the question is just as important as what it is they're trying to find out. So it's that, for us, that relationality of the people and of the culturally appropriate approaches that are being used in order to access that knowledge and data, and also, local people who have the knowledge of how to then test out, as Billy was mentioning, some of these approaches, but also being able to recognize when international methods aren't working, and how do we co-design alongside locals better ways of being able to find data, measure things, and using localized systems. I think it's just important here. So I'll stop with, the who, and the how is just as important as the what.
I think that is such a fantastic point to end on, actually, because I think we constantly, I think, get stuck on the what a lot of the time, and I think you just can't get there without the how. And I think the three of you have been able to beautifully illustrate to us the values, the systems, the processes. It's not just about, like I say, science or other people. It's relational, it's reciprocal. You've all said it's two-way, it's based on trust, it's long-term. I think you have just really painted such a great picture of so many things that we need to go away and think about. And it also leads into a quick plug before I thank our speakers for our very next session, which really builds on a lot of what we chatted about today. So our next session next week is on the role of donors, academics, and NGOs in promoting a more equitable knowledge and evidence landscape. So this session aims to discuss what concrete actions have been taken or need to be taken to promote equitable knowledge production and Global South-led research and monitoring and evaluation. So I hope very much that you'll join us for that session. The fabulous Catherine Gill, who's joined us here today and asked an excellent question, will be speaking on that session. We've got colleagues from Pakistan, from Indonesia, from the Netherlands, and Dr. Alistair Cook will be joining us as well. So it's a really, really exciting discussion. So we would love you to sign up to join that one as well. And we also are going to requesting you to undertake a quick survey for us. So that survey is going to be popped into the chat. There it is there. If you could let us know about your thoughts around the session or other kind of issues that you would like us to discuss, that would be wonderful. And just to finish, a huge, huge thank you to everyone for joining, and our wonderful panelists of giving their time, their expertise, and their amazing insights on what I think is a really, really important and interesting topic. So a huge thank you to Siale, to Alan, and to Vili. I'm glad you didn't freeze to death, Vili. You've made it through the session. A huge thank you to all of you. Take care, and we look forward very much to staying in touch with you and to ensuring that we keep Indigenous knowledge front and centre. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a lovely rest of your evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.